What happens when the science and the macabre meet? Here in the business, we've always been cooped up in our small showroom in Bushwick, so what is it like when we actually go out into the world? We went all the way to Philadelphia to experience firsthand the World Oddities Expo. After an extremely long bus ride, we finally made it to the World Oddities Expo, so let's check it out. JonsBones. The World Oddities Expo really allowed us to engage with a variety of different people, and we're so excited to share it with you today. Here at JonsBones, our mission has always been to make osteology and the history of the medical bone trade more accessible. We recently were invited down by the promoter of the World Oddities Expo, Adam Hutter, to give an hour keynote talk on the history of the medical bone trade. I'm also eternally grateful to my partner, Masha. She helped me set up and organize the keynote and helped with transportation and setting up and tearing down of the event. I wouldn't have been able to do it without her. A lot of the work that we do here is primarily online, but I really wanted to interact with real people, get thoughts from the community, be open and transparent and accountable for everyone to be able to engage and give their feedback. This experience was incredibly insightful because I actually was able to talk to a live audience for once. It wasn't just me with my phone or me with my team talking to you guys from the internet, but the experience to be able to interact and talk to a live audience was extremely fruitful for me. This has always been my goal, so the second I got this opportunity, I had to jump on it.
Hi everyone. Thanks for joining me today. Really excited to be doing this presentation. This is Skeletons in the Closet, a deep dive into the medical bone trade, where we'll be covering the medical bone trade, what happened, and a brief history on it for anyone wondering today. But just a little bit of background. My name is John. I'm the founder of JonsBones. We're a New York City osteological-based supply company. We sell mainly to universities and museums, and a big part of our mission is to raise more public accessibility and awareness about the medical bone trade and what happened and what were some of the key players in it. And I got my BFA from Parsons School of Design in industrial design. And I look at the skeletal features of the bones from more of a manufacturing standpoint and less from a bioanthropological standpoint. So I wanted to take you through this today. But first, looking at this story, what happened? Well, 5 months ago, I found myself at a house of a Secret Service agent. He had called me and said, hey, I found out who you were, and we just found this medical skeleton in a basement. They tried going to all the local schools. They couldn't find where to put it. They couldn't find where to go. They took it to the local universities, and they didn't know what to do with it. And what stunned me most is they took it to Johns Hopkins Medical Institute, and they couldn't figure out the origins of this medical skeleton. So it was at that moment I realized, wow, this is a huge problem. We need to talk about it. How can we figure out more about the history of this trade and where it all came from? So this is what I've spent the last 5 years of my life doing, and I'm happy to share it with you guys today. So first of all, why did this industry exist? According to Scott Carnegie's The Red Market, in 1983, 60,000 skulls were shipped to the US and the UK alone in 1 year. So imagine, I have 3 skulls here on display today. There were 60,000 that came in, which was astonishing. The first main reason is medical education. It used to be mandatory for most major medical students to actually buy skulls and skeletons during their time in medical school. This was common all the way from the 1700s to even modern times. It's extremely important for doctors and medical schools, practitioners, chiropractors to study from real anatomy. Here we actually have a vintage photograph from 1911 where you could see how they used to process and prepare real human skeletons before they were sold off to medical schools, medical companies, and institutions. So one thing that I really wanted to point out for you guys today is the sheer scale of how many pieces were produced and how many pieces really exist in the world. It was extremely common for doctors and medical students to actually work with and study real bones. And oftentimes when we find members of the general community, they had no idea that this industry even existed. This one is one of my favorites. It was a graduating class of medical students, and they were posing with the skeleton that they were studying with in school. So this vintage photograph is of an individual carrying up a medical skeleton to be displayed in the front windows of the Anatomy University. And this was the display in front of the school. So now you might be asking, why real bones? We now understand that doctors and medical institutions needed bones, but why real bones? The first reason is anatomical variation. Every single skeleton is different. Actually, each skeleton is more unique than a fingerprint. So being able to study one individual skeleton is not enough. You need a wide variety of bones in order to better understand the skeletal system. This is why studying multiple skeletal systems and multiple skeletons, if you're a working practitioner, is so important. This individual here was presumed, they're both presumed biological female. They're both from 1940s, and they were both prepared by the same company, Clay Adams. One was 5'3", the other was over 6 foot. If you had only studied one skeleton, you'd have an inadequate understanding of the skeletal system, and this is why it's so important to really study from real models. So it's minor yet major differences. We had a forensic anthropologist come down to his showroom, and in his school, there were no real skeletons, and he had gone all 4 years not being able to see real bones, and he got extremely emotional when being able to finally see and learn from real skeletons. But then you might be asking, why not plastic? Why can't we just study from plastic skeletons? Why did it have to be real? Well, interestingly enough, billiard balls used to be made out of ivory, and when they would be hit in a very specific way, they would shatter. So there was a competition created saying, who can create a material that could substitute ivory? What ended up winning this competition? Plastic. So now modern billiard balls are made out of plastic to substitute the chemical properties of ivory or bone. So intrinsically, plastic is made to be the furthest thing away from bone, and this is why at a true academic level, you need to study real skeletons, and even today, it's still done. For instance, this is trabeculi, and this is something that the skeletal system and plastic casting just can't replicate, and is why studying real bone is so important. So now that I've talked about why the bones existed, a little bit of history about how doctors used them, and why they couldn't use plastic, how did the bone trade happen? It started with the resurrectionists. From the 1600s to the 1700s, there were groups of grave robbers that used to steal remains and sell them to anatomy departments all over the country. There was no regulations, there were no laws on where you could and couldn't source your remains, and this is where we see a myriad of injustices happen within the medical history. And there was so much public outrage that happened that eventually, as they were going about this and as they were stealing remains, members of the public wanted something done. So in 1832, the Anatomy Act was founded. This regulated where and when medical supply companies, as well as individual practitioners, could source their remains from. And once we saw the legalization of where bodies could be sourced from, it had to be done now with proper donation, proper paperwork. Then we saw the resurgence of medical bone companies. So this led to the creation of medical bone companies as we know it today, or as commonly known as the medical bone trade. Similar to what's happening right now with cannabis, especially in New York City, once they decriminalized the sale of cannabis, we now saw stores pop up all over the country. So now that medical bone companies was now legalized and there were areas where they could and couldn't source remains from, companies popped up to meet this demand. So this is actually an outline of all of the medical companies that we've been able to document up to this point that's used to sell skeletal remains. We had the early suppliers, which are primarily French. Some would be Tremont, Auxus, Boublé, Desrolles, which used to sell skeletons to anatomists similar to the photos I showed you earlier. And then post-globalized suppliers, such as Carolina Biological Supply, Kilgore International, Charles Ward, who would sell these skeletons to universities in the US and the UK. So we've been through the process of tracking down where these companies went and where did they all go today. This is the visualization of where some of these companies existed. And in the US right now, we are the current largest country and area of handling human remains, and it's still true to this day. And even back in the day, this is why so many pieces ended up in the US. But what I find so interesting is out of the 13 major osteological supply companies that were founded, only around 3 of them are in business today. So there's no Wikipedia page, there's no documentation that's been done, and finding original source research on where these pieces came from is virtually impossible. So we really made it our goal to try to raise more public awareness to have this conversation of where did the bones come from. So in identifying medical and non-medical remains, we look at provenance and things that indicate that it is a medical skeleton. So for here we have an original Kilgore seal, a Tremont seal from Paris, and different latches and seals indicate if it is a medical specimen or not. Here's an example of some of the other companies. Carolina Biological Supply was based in Carolina. Clay Adams was based in New York City. Originally founded in the early 20s. They are still in business today, but they rebranded after moving away from medical bones. So that leads me to, where is it all now? Where are all these skeletons? There were hundreds of thousands of skeletons sold during this period. Where are they in the US? Unfortunately, they are oftentimes in attics, closets, and basements all over the country. We had a client in New Jersey contact us, and she had purchased an Oddfellows lodge. The Oddfellows Society was similar to the Freemasons, but they were famous for using real human skeletons in their practices. And in this, they were doing renovations on a house, and when they tore down the wall, there was a real human skeleton in a coffin hidden, plastered between two walls. The workers freaked out, they refused to touch it, and they didn't want to work on the house until they got rid of this skeleton. Once again, they tried to go to local schools. The schools didn't want it. They tried to go to local universities. They couldn't take it. So they eventually contacted us at JonsBones to try to find a home for it. So this was actually the skeleton here. And it's a vintage Oddfellows skeleton, and right now it's dated back to around 1890. So I've spent the last 5 years going all over the country to find medical skeletons, and currently in Brooklyn, New York, we have one of the largest collections of human osteology that's on public display. One interesting thing is dating the pieces and figuring out where they came from and what was their lineage. This was a skeleton that we found in, I think, close to Philadelphia, around an hour from here. And the individual that found this purchased a house in the 80s, and the original owner of the house was a prop master. So everything was empty, and the only thing left in this house was one skeleton in a box. And the person had no idea what to do with it, but it was speculated that it was purchased for a movie, since the previous owner was a prop master. But what I found interesting is it was bundled up and wrapped in newspaper. And the newspaper is dated 1984, which is the same year that one of the largest exporters of human remains banned exportation. So from there, this is one of the last skeletons that we saw enter into the market before the trade eventually was banned. So that leads me to, how do we know all this? How do we know all this information? The main four things are archival documents, bone catalogs, interviews, and hardware. So starting with archival documents, we looked at the antique photography that we showed you earlier on in the presentation and compare and contrast it with known and unknown pieces. So for instance, the Oddfellows skeleton, this piece and the photo is presumed to be from around the 1800s to 1900s. And here we have the exact same hanging, the exact same latch, and the exact same sternum preparation. So from there, we're able to go, wow, it is the same area, same provenance, same piece. Then we're able to identify, yes, we know where this skeleton came from, we know what period of time it came from. Because up to this point, a lot of people just don't know. This is another example that we used at the showroom. This was an antique photograph that we got of a medical skeleton and one that we got at the showroom. So we were able to compare and contrast the different joineries and hardware methods to be able to better identify the history of these pieces. Next is bone catalogs. Believe it or not, similar to Amazon sending you a brochure for what you can and can't buy, bone companies used to do the same. We have one of the largest collections of vintage bone catalogs. So this is from the company Carolina Biological Supply, and it was just as simple as getting a catalog and ordering a skeleton. We have a price sheet from 1966 where you used to be able to buy a human skull for $12. Adjusted for inflation, it would be $50 today. So it was extremely readily available. Interestingly enough, during the space race, that's when we saw commercialization of plastic. So it used to be cheaper to buy real bones compared to buying antique pieces. This is another Carolina Biological Supply, and as you look at it from the preparation methods, over the years their style and their designs changed, and so did their preparations. So as we've been able to identify original catalogs, we then are able to figure out what periods these skeletons come from, and it helps us figure out the indications of what parts of the world it was. For instance, the company Samso was based in Germany, and a lot of the skulls we see from them are European. Clay Adams was based in New York, and a lot of the skulls and skeletons are Caucasian. So based on the geographical region of where the medical supply company was based is where oftentimes they would source their remains from. because that's oftentimes a question that we get. This is another Carolina Biological Supply, one of my favorite companies. This one was from the company Clay Adams, so a little tidbit about them. They were based in New York and then later moved to New Jersey. So if you see a skeleton stamped Clay Adams, New York, you knew it was from the 70s previous. And if it's stamped Clay Adams, New Jersey, it's older than the 70s. So even in this convention, you'll see medical skeletons all over the displays and stands. And this might help you date and understand a little bit more about where they came from. And if you see on the right, this skull here is similar to the ones that we have on display. And then this is a Rudinger original skull catalog. So this is an extremely helpful way for us to be able to look at medical skeletons and say, yes, we know where this came from, we know the company, and once we know the company, we can tell what part of the world it's from. A lot of the German companies source their skulls from Europe. Clay Adams was based in New York City, so a lot of the skulls that we've seen are Caucasian. So based on the geographical region of where the skull company was, is oftentimes where the pieces were sourced from. And one last one from Samso. This was an interesting story here. This fetal skeleton that we purchased was from a doctor, and when I was asking him, I said it looked like a Kilgore skeleton, a Kilgore preparation. And the doctor said, I bought it when I was a freshman at NYU Medical Center when in 1980, between 1980 to 1986. And he said, Kilgore International set up a little tent. I bought it from them, and I named him Gregory when I opened it with my professor. So if you look here, we had the original Kilgore International catalog, and the bases are the exact same. So we were able to identify the preparator and the date in which the skeleton was prepared and sold, where previously we had no idea. So the combination of first-person accounts from previous owners as well as historical documents are extremely important in uncovering its history. And once again, with Carolina Biological Supply, they were one of the only companies to use this type of costal cartilage preparation, which is the preparation between the sternum and the ribs. So from there, we were able to identify where it was from. The next one that we do to figure out more information is interviews. We've gone all over the world to do research in medical collections where we compare known and unknown collections and able to find out more about these pieces. This is from the Silighat Anatomical Museum in Thailand. If you guys ever find yourself in Bangkok, I would highly recommend you check it out. They have one of the largest anatomical collections in the world, as well as the Museum of Osteology in Oklahoma, one of the largest osteological collections in the US for mammal anatomy, the Natural History Museum in New York City. And this is me with Sharon. Sharon actually worked at Clay Adams in the 70s. She was hired straight out of high school, 18 years old, wearing a pencil skirt, and would actually articulate the skeletons. So we were able to interview her to figure out a little bit more about where these skeletons came from and how they were prepared. And the last and most technical part is the hardware. Right here is costal cartilage. This is actually the space between the sternum and the ribs. And over the years, there have been hundreds of different preparations by different companies. So we were able to look at which pieces were made and what companies were they from. For instance, on the farthest left, this one was made by the company Adam Ruley. So based on the hardware preparation, since my background is in industrial design, I'm able to look at the manufacturing methods of the skeleton in order to identify where the piece came from. So for instance, the costal cartilage and skull latches. Every single skull company has a very unique latch. So we've been able to identify over the last 8 years which companies came from which preparations, and from there it better tells us more about the history of these pieces. And same with the pelvis. Every single skeleton has latches, hooks, patina, hardware, and through years of looking at it, we've started to figure out where they all come from, and I'm really excited to one day document and share this work. So overall, with archival documents, bone catalogs, interviews, and hardwares, we were able to find out more about a history that relatively has been uncovered over the last 100 years. And just to summarize, from the 17 to 1800s was the resurrectionists, group of grave robbers. This was when the bone industry was a wild west with no regulations. From there, it was regulated where now suppliers could and couldn't get skeletons from different areas, and we saw the pre-globalized and post-globalized trade. And then in the 70s, we saw the implementation of plastic, and then finally plastic won out, and now most medical skeletons are made out of plastic, and that leads us to modern times. But If there's any questions, I'm an open book, let me know.
On our platform, sometimes the conversations can feel a little distant. So what happens when you guys get to ask me in person? You guys are always asking, where do the bones come from? And this is your chance to find out.
Yeah, so in terms of where we get them from, in the US currently there's privatized and public donation. So what you're describing is where the bones come from in the private sector. So if an individual passes away and donates their body to science, then you go through all the paperwork and all the rigorous forms that you described. All the pieces that we work with are over 40 to 50 years old. So they're the antique pieces that come previously from the trade. So we only get them from retired doctors or universities that go out of business. So we don't work with tribal remains, we don't work with archaeological or ossuary remains, only medical remains. So if they don't have all of the latches, hardwares that we described, we don't work with it.
I think this history is extremely problematic and there's a lot that has gone into it, and we can't make simple solutions for complex problems. So in this talk, it really covered a broad history of what happened to allow members of the general public to really learn more about this history of the medical bone trade.
It's a great question. So the question was, were these pieces donated to science and how were they procured? Oftentimes, the best way that I would answer that question is it's really based on the individual company. This trade lasted for over 100 years, and each company had their own standardized practice. For instance, in the 70s, India had become the primary exporter of human remains, and this is where we see a lot of injustices that happen within the skeletal trade. And it's due to that that eventually in the 90s, there was a ban that led to eventually the entire industry stopping. But for instance, that was one part of the industry, primarily with the companies Reckness and Brothers and Sons. But there are around 7 major suppliers in India. But then companies like Adam Rulli and Clay Adams had their own methods of procurement. According to the law and what was written, it had to all be donated for science, and there needed to be paperwork. So from documents, court cases, newspaper clippings that we've read, it would have all been above board, where individuals would donate their bodies to science. Where we do see issues is when money became involved. There was heavy lobbying from universities and institutions. We need more bodies for studying. Then you start to see forged signatures and forged donation slips happen. And this is some of the tension that we're dealing with today, is what do we do with all of these remains and how do we have more public discourse and conversation about it? So I really think that there's certain conversations that need to be had.
Most importantly, I believe in having a conversation. Oftentimes when we're in the showroom and working on social media, it ends up being a one-way door. So finally being able to talk to people live, to hear and answer questions made my year. And this is why I do what I do, is to try to make this information more accessible and digestible for you at home.
And for the final question, a gentleman asked us what the difference was between museum collections and what we do here at JonsBones.
It really just depends. There's a difference between medical companies and just general sourcing of medical supply versus institutions. Oftentimes institutes would have unique physicians that would source their own collections. The Mutter collection, the Morton collection, these were all individuals that were done by physicians. So then that's where you start to see a little bit of what you're describing, but it was not specific to these pieces. From a lot of the catalogs that we see, they were just sold as medical skulls. So oftentimes, ethnicity was removed from it. And I guess that's the question that we have now is, what do you do with it today? These pieces all exist in the market. What's the best that we can do? We find that having active discourse, the three main things that we hear is repatriation, donation, and burial. And in those, talking about each of those topics, first one is burial. We've had conversations with a lot of mortuary scientists, and improper disposal of human remains is illegal. You can't actually take ashes and dump it, so that's a huge challenge. And due to the scale of this industry, it's speculated that there are between 100,000 to 500,000 skulls in circulation in the US today. So you can't just have a giant hole in every state where at the end of the month you just throw your skulls in. So though noble, the process of burial is not as reliable as we'd like it to be. The next is repatriation. Repatriation is the act of returning remains to a specific group or area of study. So we see a lot of repatriations for indigenous groups. For instance, NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, deals with primarily Native American remains. But since these remains fall out of specific indigenous groups, since we have Caucasian skulls, European skulls, it becomes quite challenging of where do you return it to. The way that the skulls were cleaned, they were first soaked in ammonia and then later hydrogen peroxide. There's no DNA evidence left in the skull. And the only DNA evidence that is usually deep in the enamel of the teeth. So it's extremely cost prohibitive to do this. So you can't return them and you cannot find the families of origin. So here we have that tension. The last thing we hear is donation. Oh, just donate all the skeletons. And in that, we had a skeleton that came into the showroom with a gunshot wound in the tibia and fibula, which would be on the shin, and it had dated back to the Civil War. I specialize in medical history from 1850 onwards, but that piece fell out of my area of expertise because it was a very specific period. So I thought that the Military Museum of Medicine in DC should have the piece. So I'm friends with a curator there, and even while talking to them, it took us over 9 months to donate the piece. So I had a foot in the door. I work within this industry, but the process of me going through that was extremely challenging due to the paperwork. So first and foremost, I always advocate that if somebody wants to donate it, that would be the best cause to do if that's what they want. But oftentimes, it's not as equitable from state to state, since there aren't as many medical museums around to deal with the scale and volume of this industry. So what we do here at JonsBones is we purchase back the skeletons from the individuals, we document them, photograph them, curate them, and we allow them to be posted online for anatomists and artists to use for education, and then we sell the pieces back to universities, because at least that way they can be used for their intended purpose, which is education, understanding, and science. So until the technology comes where we can find a better solution of what to do with the skulls, we found that this is the best thing that we could do so far. So that's kind of where we're at today. And if any of you guys ever find yourself in Brooklyn and want to come see the showroom, we'd love to have you. But thank you. If any of you wanted to come see the pieces, feel free to.
There were so many different people in the audience that range from general enthusiasts all the way to doctors, nurses, and medical professionals. Being able to exchange hand in hand with you guys was extremely insightful, and I really appreciate you coming down and taking time out of your day to learn more about this history that I'm so passionate about. I'm so grateful for everybody that came down to support us and to support JonsBones. It really has affirmed our mission to make this more transparent and more accessible, really being able to talk with members of the community both from the professional sense as well as the members of the broader community. It led to a lot of productive conversation. We even have open showroom tours every Friday where we allow members of the general public to come down and to take an hour tour into the history of the medical bone trade and what really happened within the last 100 years. We really invite anyone to come down to the showroom to just ask us general questions. We would love to participate and hear more from the general community. In the future, when we have more keynotes, if you found this video interesting, be sure to keep up with our social media for when we will have future events. If you guys are interested in learning more about this amazing world, be sure to check out our next video that covers it in more depth.